Good morning, everyone. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to welcome you here today, and I'd like to offer a special welcome to our distinguished guests for our cyber discussion today. It's terrific to welcome back His Excellency Ambassador Sorin Ducaru, the Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO and a good friend of the Atlantic Council, Christopher Painter, the U.S. Secretary of State's first coordinator for cyber issues, and Jay Healey, the Director of the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft initiative at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. And I'll hand it over shortly to our skilled moderator, Vago Muradian, who's with us, the editor of Defense News. So today marks the release of two Atlantic Council publications. First, NATO's cyber capabilities, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And second, one on confidence-building measures in cyberspace, a multi-stakeholder approach for stability and security. The first is an issue brief analyzing NATO's past, present, and future cyber organizations and capabilities. And the second is a report proposing specific cyber confidence-building measures, or CBMs. And the CBM report is the result of a series of discussions at a workshop on cyberspace that was sponsored by NATO's Science for Peace and Security program that was convened in March in Stockholm. And so both of these reports come out as innovative, thoughtful, and great examples of the work that our Cyber Statecraft program is generating here. So I encourage you all to pick these up if you haven't had a chance to take a look at them already. Today's event itself is also the second installment in the Council's Cyber Risk Wednesday series. This series is dedicated to a deeper discussion and understanding of solutions to systemic cyber risk. The first event was held in October, and the panelists discussed the current cyber threat environment. You can always find the video on the Atlantic Council website if you missed that discussion. And our next Cyber Risk Wednesday event will be December 10th, and we'll examine security challenges and societal opportunities of networked medical devices, something that's been in the news recently. But for today, we want to discuss NATO's cyber policy, announced just a few months ago, a new policy at the NATO summit in Wales. This policy aims to make cyber defense part of the alliance's core task, to reaffirm that international law applies in cyberspace, and to enhance NATO's cooperation with industry on cyber challenges. NATO's new policy aims to take awareness, education, training, and exercise activities forward, and to encourage cooperative initiatives, including those between partner nations and international organizations with the alliance. However, the exact approach of achieving these aims remains to be determined. The agenda at Wales still is being implemented today. So that's where today's discussion comes in, and we're looking forward to hearing from our panelists on what they think the path forward should be, will be, what the obstacles are, and the threats they expect NATO members to encounter in the future. So before I turn over the floor, I would like to say just a quick introduction to our panelists. We're delighted to welcome our dear friend, Ambassador Sorin Ducaru. Sorin currently serves as Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, as I mentioned. He provides support to NATO and advises the Secretary General on the evolution of emerging security challenges and their impact on NATO security. But prior to this, he had an extensive career. Prior to his appointment, he served as Romania's permanent representative to NATO. From 2001 to 2006, he served as Romania's ambassador to the United States, where we worked closely with him from 2000 and 2001, and as permanent representative of Romania to the United Nations as well. Chris Painter is with the U.S. State Department as the Secretary's first coordinator on cyber issues. Chris leads diplomatic efforts to advance an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet and information infrastructure. Prior to joining the State Department, as most of you know, he served in the White House as Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy. And during this time, he developed the President's 2011 International Strategy for Cyberspace, and he chaired the high-level interagency working groups that were devoted to international cyber issues. Jason Healey is the Director of our own Cyber Statecraft initiative at the Brent Scowcroft Center. Under Jay's leadership, the initiative has become a hub for very practical, relevant solutions to challenges in cyberspace. Jay's mission is to demystify the overlap of traditional national security and cyberspace, and we are ever grateful for his leadership and expertise on this set of issues. And finally, I'm going to put us in the good hands of our good friend Vago Muradian. Vago's been the editor of Defense News since 2002. Prior to this, he was the editor of Defense Daily International and the Business and International reporter for Defense Daily. He's got extensive background background on defense issues across multiple countries and regions, and is a frequent guest here at the Atlantic Council. Let me invite Vago and the panel to the stage, please.
Thanks, Damon, for that warm introduction. It's always an honor to be back here. It's also an honor to be on an august panel like this one. You know, when it comes to cyber, I mean, it's eternally fascinating as the great equalizer. You know, whether you're an individual in a basement or whether you're a nation state, you know, you can wield enormous power. I mean, there was that one guy in a Shanghai basement who was controlling 66 million computers. That strikes me as something that's both fascinating and terrifying at the same time. And all of us are carrying, on our phones, the vehicle for espionage on us. All of our information's there, all of our contacts are there, our schedules are there. Somebody can actually turn the device on and listen to what it is I'm talking to. Mine would be uninteresting conversations, but I suggest, Sorin, yours might be a more interesting device that could attract somebody's interest, or Damon's or somebody else's. And you're not just talking about the individual challenges, but also the giant systemic challenges, which Jay and I and others have talked about what happens in the event that something really, really big goes down and takes with it tremendous amounts of information that we thought was secure. The ground rules for today is everybody's going to get a couple of minutes at the very top to make some opening remarks. I will then take the moderator's prerogative to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor and hopefully have an engaging discussion this morning. So with that, Sorin.
Well, thank you very much. Also, thank you, Damon, for the introduction. It's great to be back in Washington, even if it's only for half a day, and see some of the old friends. And it's great to be with Atlantic Council. Let me mention that there is indeed a special partnership that NATO and my division has with Atlantic Council, with a Statecraft initiative. By the way, one of the studies that has been just finished, confidence building measures, was under Science for Peace and Security program. And frankly, we're looking forward to have this briefed also at headquarters sometimes soon. And I'm glad and really always encouraged when I'm on the same side with Chris Painter. Always benefited for great advice, and especially this year, that was a really tense year in the development of the policy interaction and guidance from nations, because what we are doing in NATO as staff, trying to put together in a consensus in consensus documents the guidance that we receive for nations, and with this I will go to the substance and to give you a couple of in a couple of minutes a short outline of what this new enhanced NATO policy on cyber defense is, how it's different from the previous two policies. It's a policy endorsed on 5th of September by heads of state and government at the Wales summit. By the way, the first NATO policy on cyber defense was in 2008, after the famous famous attacks against Estonia. That was what we call the foundational policy, establishing the basic principles, requirements for NATO, for allies. And then in 2011, after the strategic concept, the new strategic concept of Lisbon was adopted, this was end of November 2010, and then first half of 2011, we have adopted the second NATO policy, the 2.0, as we call it in our jargon. That was about consolidation and centralization of protection of NATO's networks, mainly. And we have achieved under this policy the centralization of protection of NATO's networks over 50 plus sites, which start with Brussels headquarters, commands in Shape or in Norfolk, agencies, points of contact at nations, and so on and so forth. The enhanced policy is about enhancement. There was a debate of how to call it, and at a certain point there was even political sensitivity about the name enhanced policy. Many nations were saying, well, we don't want necessarily a bigger policy, we want a better policy. But upgrade was not politically sound enough, so we went for enhance, and it is about enhancement. And I would try to capture this in a kind of structured manner on 3 layers. The first layer is what I would call the recalibration of the cyber paradigm within NATO, of the conceptual debate. And this was achieved through linking cyber defense with collective defense. By the way, this was tried even in 2008. It wasn't the right context. It was in this context and in this policy that we have this clear link. And actually, it's also about the mainstreaming of cyber across the other core tasks, which are crisis management also and cooperative security and the main objectives. The second point was the fact that NATO recognized that international law applies in cyberspace, which was again a huge element, and also showed the fact that NATO doesn't want this space to be ungoverned. That NATO wants to link and to abide by the norms, and actually would support, while not being a source of international law, would support the efforts that are done at the international level in order to generate norms and values and laws in this field. There was another element that I would like to highlight on this level. It provides a framework of assistance to allies, both in times of normal business, through assisting allies deliver on their own responsibilities to develop capabilities to defend against cyber attacks and develop the resilience, through the use of NATO's defense planning process and establishing defense capability targets, very much like on conventional capability, and using this process, using other mechanisms as well, and in times of crisis by using NATO's crisis response mechanism, using the information sharing capacity, and also NATO's common funded asset, which is what we call the NCIRC, including the rapid reaction teams that NATO now has, of course, on a case-by-case basis and upon NATO's allies' approval. This is the first layer, the conceptual changes. The next layer I would call the re-emphasis and putting a really different focus on capability development and capacity building. And this is about capability development both at NATO level. We are now implementing policy action plan items on what we call the NCIRC follow-on measures, building redundancies, expanding the number of protected sites, linking or bringing deployed networks under the centralized protection. Just a couple of examples. Also, we're going to have the second NDPP cycle next year in 2015, where we establish next level capability targets for all nations. And I mentioned here also about capacity building. There is a strong emphasis on training, education, and exercises. That's why we have already a program of exercises, both devoted specifically for cyber, like the Cyber Coalition annual exercise, and I think in 2 weeks we have the next one in Tartu, Estonia. Mm-hmm. But then also including cyber in the other exercises, for example, CMX, the crisis management exercises. And also the fact that NATO has decided to develop a NATO cyber range based on the offer made by the Estonian government to use their defense ministry cyber range and upgrade it for increased exercises. And then the next layer, and I will finish with that one, is what I call the reevaluating the ways of doing business, the new ways of doing business in cyber, both inside NATO, through a streamlined governance structure under the lead policy role of the Cyber Defense Committee that was just created in spring, because we had some stovepiping in the past where different committees with different, or bodies with different functionalities were kind of reporting parallelly to the council, generating less coherence. With bringing this under the political oversight and coordination of Cyber Defense Committee, we're in a new stage, and we learn a lot from the experience in the past. But this is not just about the doing business inside NATO. There is a completely new approach in the terms of doing business with partners. And here I mean partner nations, international organizations, mainly EU, but also OEC, UN, and Council of Europe. And the big, I would say, splash and the openness in the policy is the creation of what is called the initiative of the NATO Industry Cyber Partnership. And here, industry includes generically also academia and the think tank community. So it's not just the private sector per se. And I could be dwelling more on this. I will stop here.
We'll have an opportunity to discuss it. And one of the interesting things is, not just what Russia is doing, but what China is doing. You have the sandworm attack, the White House under assault, and so we're going to look at some, if not all of those, or as much of them as we can. Chris.
So I wanted to focus, first of all, I want to second really everything the ambassador said, and say how supportive we are of this evolving role that we've had over the last number of years in terms of NATO, particularly with NATO's enhanced cyber defense policy, and really the critical importance of making sure that NATO's own networks are secure. And that's really what drove a lot of this from the very beginning. And that was an important aspect of all of this, which is still ongoing. The work isn't done yet, but there's been, I think, a lot of progress there, and I think that's really important. And then I also wanted to really focus on one element that he mentioned, which was the importance of the NATO leaders' declaration reaffirming or affirming that international law, including the UN Charter, law of armed conflict, et cetera, international humanitarian law, applies in cyberspace just like it does in the physical world. And as you said, this is a clear statement that this is not a lawless space. There are boundaries when you get to that very high threshold of armed conflict and what things apply. And I think there was some doubt before that there was some thought that there was you would have different rules entirely for the cyber world and the physical world, which would make no sense, and in fact could be very destabilizing in the long term. So it was an important affirmation, really an affirmation of something that we got within the UN group of governmental experts, which was then 15 countries, included China, Russia, India, the US, Germany, among others, where we reached that conclusion just about a year ago or a year and a half ago. And that itself was a real landmark to get that conclusion of that, but then expands it and gets that toward more international acceptance that this is in fact the case. Now, how international law applies in these contexts is something that we're looking at. We're taking forward now in the next GG, which already had one meeting in January, just recently we'll have another meeting in January. So that's already underway. That's an expanded group of countries. It's 20 countries. We're looking at those issues, and I think that's an important development, certainly important coming out of the NATO summit as part of this overall cyber effort in NATO. I want to build on that a little bit. I should say that it seems like we're on tour because we were in Paris, we were just in Bonn on Monday, we're here. So obviously there's a lot of close relationship between the US and NATO, and there's a lot of activity happening internationally on the range of different cyber issues, but particularly on the international security issues. I often say that cyber is now the new black because everyone cares about it. It's become so popular that it's a new fashion statement, which is good and bad because everyone is focusing on it. But at the same time, you have to have real concrete discussions, make sure that you're matching the things you're discussing to the right forums, and that's always a bit of a challenge. And people still are not exactly sure what all these things mean or what the implications are. But I think we've been making some substantial progress. One, as I mentioned, the international law area. The other is, we're trying to build, as I said, on this this conclusion that was reached in the GG, the international law applies. And part of that is, I said, how do principles like distinction and proportionality apply in cyberspace? We are, in our submissions to the GG, we're articulating some of those, trying to spark that conversation. But there's also this question of what below that very high threshold, what are the kind of norms that should apply in cyberspace? Because you seldom get to that very high threshold of armed conflict. Even though some people, I think, erroneously say we're in the middle of a cyber war every 10 minutes, that's not really the case. So what are the thresholds below that very high threshold? And I term these, and we term these peacetime norms. What are the peacetime norms that we might want to advance and get increasing groups around the world, larger concentric circles, larger like-minded but big tent like-minded affirmation of. And these are things which states might, for stability purposes in the long term, refrain from doing or agree to do together, things that might touch on not absent wartime attacking critical infrastructure, not attacking computer emergency response teams or CSIRTs that actually are meant to mitigate conflicts, a duty to cooperate, both law enforcement and otherwise, when you see attacks that seem to be emanating from your territory. So I think these are important developments in trying to socialize the next level down, and that's something that we've been concentrated on. The other thing we've been focusing on is, and we've been doing this for some time, is focusing on the practical aspects. Understanding there's going to be policy differences between states, particularly between particular adversaries or frenemies even, that you want to be able to, at the same time, have ways of building better transparency, cooperation, and ultimately stability. So if you think of what confidence building measures are, and they have their roots in the nuclear world, I think of them as a pyramid, where the lowest level of the pyramid is transparency measures, not rocket science really, just transparency measures that builds better understanding and transparency between countries. The next level up would be cooperative measures, and then finally, where you cooperate against third-party threats. And the third level would be, and this is I think in more of the long term, stability measures. How do you engage countries in acts that will build greater cyber stability, where every country has an incentive to act and to build that stability rather than to destroy that stability. In that area, we've done quite a lot of work, particularly, again, this was signaled out in the GGE report, the importance of confidence building measures, not just this time, but the time before that. And we have significantly within the group of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe reached a decision among the 57 countries there that confidence building measures were important, and we reached an initial set of these confidence building measures, 11 of them. I don't know why it was 11. It's like the Spinal Tap movie. You couldn't decide on 10, so it went to 11. But we have 11 basic confidence building measures, which I think are important. They involve things like and these really are transparency measures, exchanging doctrine, setting up a database so that you can exchange points of contact in various countries that would facilitate communication. We're in the process of implementing these 11 right now. And they also, one of the CBMs also calls for the OSCE and participating states, allows a participating state to call for consultations or request assistance when a cyber incident reaches the threshold of national concern. And if you think about that, that really is an advancement over where we were, say, with Estonia back in 2007, where we really didn't have those kind of mechanisms in place. So these are, as I said, are in the implementation stage now, where we're building this together with the normative environment. And these CBMs, I think, are very important. We're also looking at other regional forums like ARF and these forums, I think NATO has a role here, but NATO, I think, is not the place to actually develop these CBMs because we have these other political bodies that are doing it. But once these CBMs are developed, there may be things that NATO can do in terms of tabletop sort of things to kind of advance them. So I think it's important the way we've been taking that forward. The next stage up would be cooperative measures, and indeed we're building on those 11 OSCE transparency measures. We're now looking at various cooperative measures that we could take forward, and the United States has engaged in some of these themselves. When we had the attacks against our financial networks, and Ellen, who I see in the audience, has written about this in the past. When we had the attacks against our financial networks, we did something that was unusual. It wasn't unusual for us to reach out through search channels and through law enforcement channels. And these were botnets, so they were distributed all over the world. Hundreds of countries, concentration would shift from day to day. So what we did is we reached out through our technical channels, but we also did diplomatic démarches to a number of countries, to over 20 countries, asking for assistance and saying, this is really important, help us, to try to build this more cooperative framework against shared cyber threats. And that's a good example of a cooperative measure, and I think we're trying to take some of those forward as well as we go forward. So there's been a lot of activity here, and I think that what's happened at NATO is an important part of all of this, but there's a lot of activity really throughout the world as we engage not just countries that are our traditional allies, but a larger concentric circle, and even the countries that disagree with us on these issues.
Thanks very much, Chris. Jay?
Great, thanks. Oh, when Damon kicked us off and did the introduction, he said that a big point of our program is trying to demystify cyber, of trying to look at what is most similar to what we're used to as national security, international relations professionals, which I guess many of the room are. So what things in this cyber are similar to what we learned in school or that are similar to our day-to-day jobs? And which of those things might seem similar but are actually quite different? And we've tried to get that across in not just in events like this, but in the documents that we've come out with, which I'll limit my comments to that for right now. So we came out with this report on NATO cyber capabilities. Because when we started this program about 3 years ago, we knew that with the role of the Atlantic Council playing, we want to be the transatlanticists, we want to be the home for NATO. So if we're doing a cyber program, we're going to have to be the home for NATO cyber as much as we can. And it was really difficult to try and figure out what NATO is up to get a single document. I think it's getting better now with some of the material on the website. But we really wanted to have a place where someone that's new to the field can just sit down and say, what's going on with the new policy, what's going to the old policy, and importantly, how did we get from 1999, Allied force, where NATO really started seeing attacks and having to get their arms around this new topic, to today. What's happened over that 15 years? What's the backstory to get to today? And we think that looking at which of these things are different and which are the same can really help NATO in a lot of this. And what we've found is that it's not always what we're told by the most technical folks. What we've found is that the more strategically significant the conflict, the more similar it is to conflict in the air, land, and sea. So I'll say that again. The more strategically significant the conflict, the more similar it is to conflict in the air, land, and sea. As an example, I suspect that NATO would rarely have an Article 5 that would be for cyber. If we ever get to Article 5 for cyber, it's probably not because we have a cyber problem, it's because we have a Russia problem. That cyber isn't so different that it's likely to be two kids in their basement that are constituting a strategic attack on NATO. It's most likely to be a nation state that can really bring capabilities to bear. And what is the more likely nation state than the one that's flying Bear H's doing simulated missile strikes now? One of the other things that we've found, though, so a lot of what we talk about in our program is how similar cyber conflict tends to be to regular conflict, at least at the high end, the more strategically significant it is. One of the biggest differences we found is the role of the private sector. Because in normal conflict, you expect the private sector to get out of the way. That even if it's a fight in urban terrain, you expect civilians are going to try and get out of there if they can. And cyber is not like that, in ways that I still think we're trying to get our arms around. For example, I've talked to senior flag officers in DoD, and they say, I get it, Jay, that when we're fighting in cyber, normally if we were doing air combat, we're not going to have 747s flying through, or if we're going into a battle between fleets, we're not going to have cruise ships sailing through. And that's actually not, when I hear that, to me, that's us not understanding the point. Because the civilians aren't sailing their ships through your cyber fight. We are fighting in networks that they have built for their own purposes. We're sailing our ships through their ocean that they built, that the private sector built with their own resources. So this role of the private sector, I think, is the most defining characteristic of cyberspace and therefore of cyber conflict. Not the speed of the domain, that it operates on network speed, not that it's intercontinental, not that it has low barriers of entry, the things that we tend to hear, for example, in DoD doctrine, but that it's private sector dominant. So that's why we came out with how we did with the confidence building measures document. Because when we tend to think about confidence building measures, when governments tend to think about confidence building measures, we tend to come at it from nuclear, right? And there's no role, there's very little role for the private sector in to be talking about confidence building measures between nations to decrease conflict. I mean, there's maybe some on the sides, but not predominantly. And when we looked back at the history of cyber conflict, we saw all sorts of examples of very strong norms and ways that the private sector might build confidence amongst themselves and bring governments along with them. One example off the top is East-West Institute was trying to do stuff to get China and United States together to reduce spam. We've got great examples of where we have or where we might build norms, build confidence building measures from, and we were a bit hesitant to use this word on it, for multi-stakeholder, of saying, yes, of course, some of this can be government to government, but we might also look at where, for example, telecommunications companies and ISPs in different countries might come together and build confidence between themselves to defeat, for example, denial of service attacks or taking down botnet attacks. We took a few other examples of areas where we might be able to bring in the private sector. One of my favorite examples was after the Cheonan incident. This was the South Korean corvette, Navy vessel that exploded. And we were pretty sure that it was the North Koreans. We called together an international group to investigate this, to look at all of the evidence and say who they thought did it, was responsible. And it looked like the North Koreans were, in fact, the most responsible. I think that's a great model if we ever have an attack like Estonia again. Get someone that has real international standing. Tim Berners-Lee, Vint Cerf, and some technical chops that can bring together a group to say, boy, who do we think? Where does the evidence point? Both the technical and the non-technical evidence point if we had another attack like 2007 Estonia, and really say who we think was the nation most responsible, if any. I see that as a confidence building measure. It might not fit in with how Chris thinks about confidence building measures, so I might be being imprecise with that terminology, but it's certainly a measure that can build confidence, at least among the other countries involved. Maybe not for the one that gets accused, but certainly for the other countries that are involved. I've got a few other comments, but I guess I can wait. Thanks,
Don't
Vago.
want to get accused of doing something, you shouldn't have your hand in the cookie jar, perhaps.
Right.
But
right. And when Estonia in 2007 went and said, "Can you please help us?" every country they asked did in fact help, except for one.
Right. I wonder what that country could have been. Sorin, let me ask you. I mean, we've talked about obviously the Estonia attack. What are some of the other major motivating forces that have driven NATO to the new policy? And specifically, if I could ask you about the recent sandworm attack, and what you can tell us about that, how successful it was, and how damaging it was.
Well, as I mentioned, Estonia triggered the first policy, but there were things that followed. First, NATO follows the threat evolution that is really visible, not just at the high end, but at all levels, like from data exfiltration to crime, up to what would mean significant disruption or even destruction. So what followed after Estonia? We saw the first time the use of cyber means in a military conflict, and this was Georgia, 2008. We saw the impact of cyber means on physical equipment, such as in the case of Stuxnet, or more recently against Saudi Aramco. We also saw the same use of cyber in a military operation more recently in Ukraine. We saw NATO being under increasing attack, and I would say the only one that had an impact so far was the DDoS attack of the night before the Crimea referendum. This was when NATO's website was taken out for a couple of hours. That night it was back at 8 o'clock in the morning. But again, something that we did not experience. In terms of intensity of attack, there are different metrics that my colleagues from NCERC are bringing. They say there are a couple of maybe hundreds of thousands of attacks suspicious activities per day, maybe millions per week. But a handful of this, most of them are dealt with in an automatic fashion. A handful, or about a dozen per week, generate special expert attention. You mentioned the sandworm campaign. This was a campaign that was monitored by our experts in December 2013, although I was told by experts that in their community at that time the name was Black Energy. It was one of the maybe dozens of campaigns that we have per month. Mitigations measures, of course, have been put in place, and there has been no evidence of any impact over NATO's functioning. But to give you a sense, this got some news traction because it was in the eyesight report. By the way, that report was mainly about something else, the zero-day vulnerability in Microsoft, and the sandworm was not linked to that. It was mentioned as an example of how things, how threats are evolving, and how even organizations like NATO or European Unions are targeted. But the way, let me give you, put it in context. As I said, it was one of a dozen campaigns that we see per month. Let me put it this way. It got more visibility because of that report. Some other campaign could get tomorrow another visibility. And those campaigns that actually we followed, we took mitigations measures, and we keep a bit the history of how these campaigns are monitored is kept in our division. We have the CTEC, the Cyber Threat Assessment Cell, that deals with following trends, blending information and signals intelligence, also with human intelligence, and following specific trends, while NSIC and our experts in NSIC deal with a day-to-day response to the attacks. So one does the kind of the firefighters work, the other ones more the analytical and the study work.
Chris, let me ask you. I mean, one of the things that you talked about was obviously in confidence building measures, but also transparency and the importance to bring a rule of law into a space that's seen as a lawless space. Some of the work you're doing as the chair of the U.S.-China Cyber Working Group, for example. You've worked also with Russia. But there are also two countries that seem to also disregard, right, certain norms where they're regarded as sort of consistent, persistent adversaries, whether it's for NATO or whether for the United States. The White House website was recently hacked. U.S. government has responded by indicting senior Chinese officials with that. The president is going to be in Beijing next week. He is going to talk to Xi Jinping and raise this issue forcefully regarding cyber. But there is also, these countries continue to keep doing it. Why is this effort on the part of the president in this particular instance going to be successful this time when you might argue the terabytes of data that are leaving every day suggests they may have an edge over us?
So what I'd say is that, this, in fact, my boss, Secretary Kerry, just spoke about this yesterday, and certainly the president has said it many times, that the theft of intellectual property, and as I talk about these norms, this is one of them, the theft of intellectual property to benefit your commercial sector is something that we don't think any country should engage in. As Secretary Kerry said yesterday, this is not just because we think this is wrong and we think this is damaging and this goes to the life's blood of our companies, but also to many other countries around the world. But it doesn't benefit the countries who are doing it in the long run. It doesn't really help them grow their economy the way they think it does. I mean, it's a short-term gain, but a long-term loss. And so, I think it's very important for us, as we have been, being very clear that this is unacceptable conduct, and to make that point and make that strongly, and make the point that it's not just limited to the cyber environment. This is something that really does create real friction in the relationship, and there's an overall relationship that's at stake. So I think that's important, and I think that message is clear and will continue to be delivered. Now, at the same time, and you heard this from Secretary Kerry yesterday, that even with countries where we're having issues with, we need to be able to engage in some substantive dialogue with them, because there's a lot of different issues in cyberspace, including trying to make sure that we don't have inadvertent misperception, miscalculation, and inadvertent escalation in cyberspace, given the immaturity in a lot of ways of this area, and so and the lack of transparency. And so I think it's important for us. I thought it was it was unfortunate when the Chinese, in reaction to the indictments, suspended the working group, because the working group is not just a venue for talking about issues that concern us, which is important for both sides to have a venue like that, but it is also important for us to try to figure out those areas where you can cooperate on, those areas we can build better transparency, because it's not there right now, and build better trust on. So all of this, I think, hangs together. That's a message we've been delivering, we'll continue to deliver. I'd also say, it's not just that we see China and Russia in the context of bilateral discussions. We also see them in the GGE context. We see them in a lot of other contexts around the world. So it's important to understand where we differ and where we need to be strong in saying what those differences are, and make it clear what our concerns are and that we want change. But also we have to figure out ways that we can build the kind of better stability that's not just beneficial for the two of our countries, but also for the rest of the world.
But how can you suggest that it's not being successful for China, that when you look at the speed of their economic gain, a lot of it is, I mean, if I may be wrong on this, but as I recall, Chery, China broke into Volkswagen, stole the designs for a new car that Chery put on the market more quickly than Volkswagen did, and it was a copy of the Volkswagen car, and it's because they hacked into Volkswagen and stole it. I mean, you could argue that there are numerous instances where that theft is actually proving remarkably...
So there are two things. So first of all, there are costs to doing things like that. There are costs in terms of your soft power, both bilaterally, but also with other countries. There's cost in terms of countries who want to invest there, who want to have their businesses there, who want to...
And so they don't invest, for example.
Right, and they want to take advantage of the markets there. There is a lot of costs that are both short-term but long-term costs too. And then the question is, do you really innovate? Do you build the capability to innovate if you're simply stealing the trade secrets in the beginning? So there are, it's a complex area, but there's cost to doing this, both reputational costs and other costs, and certainly making it clear that this is something that we don't agree with and other countries doing the same raises that reputational cost, and that goes beyond just the cyber cone. But then you also have to look at the economic issues, and it's not all gain. I mean, I think it in fact does in the long term have a real effect, and that's what Secretary Kerry said yesterday.
Jay, when you look at, the whole issue is not only, how we as the United States has a tendency of looking at this. I mean, you sort of mentioned sort of the foundational disagreement, right? That it's not a government space in which civilians are operating, but actually the other way around. The synthetic space was created by industry.
That's a good word.
Maybe spawned from government, but certainly created, managed, run on industry servers. But even getting the United States to look at cyber from a fire safety standpoint, right? If you have your house out in the countryside and it burns down, it's just your house. If your house is burning in the city, that's the reason why you have to put that out, even if there is a collective element to this, and certainly cyber is, you're only as good as your weakest link in some respects. But we heard from Sorin that even the debate of enhanced, for example, like yielded a debate where people couldn't even agree on the word enhanced. So if you're looking at this context, what's the right framework to look at it where you not only get the United States online, but you also get a lot of disparate nations with a lot of disparate interests on the same page, when even something like a Crimea invasion doesn't necessarily have the sort of unified sanction response that folks may have wanted to see from the alliance, or Washington.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there. Cyber seems so weird and different, and it's really an inhibited seeing which of the old laws or ways of thinking about it might apply. I'm actually quite hopeful that after Crimea or during Crimea, the SACEUR General Breedlove came out and said, Russia, we will not be tricked. We see these little green men in Crimea with high-end Spetsnaz weapons, and even though they're not wearing a flag on their uniforms, we won't be fooled. We know who was behind this. That same mental process, that same analytical process that you get to see little green men in Crimea are there because the Kremlin wants them to be, it's pretty much the same mental process you have to get to see the packets that are showing up in Tallinn in 2007 are there because the Kremlin wants them to be. So I am hopeful that having been through Crimea and having SACEUR come out and say, we're not going to be tricked about attribution, we know the nation responsible, that we can now, it'll be easier for us now when you see a country trying to say it's not us behind this cyber attack, that we're going to be able to see the country that's actually behind the cyber attack. Now, you had brought up the fire and safety code. There's another another mindset to try to get there. The main ones we tend to use, the different mindsets, are this is a technical problem, it's crime or espionage or warfare. Those tend to be the main mindset. So if someone says cyber is a bad thing, we need better firewalls, we need to make sure the ones and zeros get through, they're coming at it from a technical way. Or if someone says, yes, cyber is bad, they're stealing our secrets, or cyber is bad, it is an act of war, it could be an act of war, right? They're approaching it from espionage or warfare. If they say cyber is bad, we need to lock more people up, they're coming at it from a criminal approach. Those are all useful, but especially the crime, espionage, and warfare, right? Those are government-centric. If you mostly see this as a crime and espionage or a warfare problem, the solution is government action to a significant degree, right? We need more cops. We need to lock up the bad guys. Because crime, espionage, or warfare, there's no role for you or me as citizens. Our role as citizens is not to be in the war zone, to not be a victim, to report if we've been a victim of a crime. Some of the other mindsets that you brought up, like fire code, starts getting to, what are my responsibilities to others around me if my building burns, or to the owner of the building? Some of the other ones that come up, public health model. You start seeing CDC for the internet come up. Idea dates back at least to 1998 with PDD 63, President Clinton's directive of 1998. It's good for some things. It's especially good if you've got a fast-moving crisis that you need to respond to. Public health models is good because it talks about mandatory measurement of epidemiology. I like sometimes to talk about the analogies to finance sector. And maybe in finance sector you can worry about a bank failing, but you then say, well, what if it's not just an individual bank failing, it's a real shock. And it's not just one thing, it spreads out of Wall Street and hits Main Street. That really intrigues me as we start looking forward to the problems of the next 10 years? What if an IT company that's too big to fail has a Lehman Brothers moment? It's there with everybody's data on Friday and it's gone on Monday. Imagine what those cascading failures are going to be. We can't model that. We can just barely get our heads around that in 2014. What are we going to do 5 years from now? I also like the environmental model of saying, right, if the environment is a problem because there's pollution, all of us have to try and approach this and solve it, right? It's not just individual companies, but we have to start worrying about our own recycling. It's also a rich source of norms, right? I mean, where did the norm come that we have to? I feel like a jerk if I show up at the supermarket and I don't have my own bag, right? I have a right.
You can just pay 5 cents, Jay. I mean,
Right.
It's okay. You don't have to live with the stigma.
But we come in with that norm that came out of nowhere, and it's a private sector norm saying, I'll give up my rights because I think it's the best thing to do. And those norms are tightest for the young that are the digital generation. So if we start thinking about denial of service attacks as pollution into our environment, all of a sudden it starts to unlock all these new ways of thinking about how you can deal with it. You know, pollution, I mean, I know some might not like this, but cap and trade, or have a pollution market, where all right, I'll be able to pollute, I'll be able to have dirtier networks, and I'll be able to buy licenses to do this from someone that has cleaner networks. It starts to unlock all sorts of different ways to think about it, and we include that as one of the CBNs.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one other, throw out another possible analogy. And I agree with Jay that the private sector clearly has a role in a range of different activities here. When we're talking about denial of service attacks, certainly there's things the governments could do, there's things the private sector do. There's things, because governments have different capabilities in different countries, they are dealing with their private sectors in those countries in different ways. And when we're talking about possible norms that are, for instance, forbearing from attacking critical infrastructures, that has a very big role with the private sector since they operate them. The sort of analogy I'd like to throw out there, and you can't take this too far, but I think it's an interesting one too, is when we talk about, you asked, how do you get all these disparate countries with disparate views to rally around particular norms in cyberspace? And if you look historically, this is not new. We've done this in a whole range of different areas. Money laundering, that's a good example, where there are a lot of countries who turned a blind eye to that, and now they don't, because you built this ever-increasing group of a like-minded, big tent like-minded, until if you were outside that group, you'd be marginalized. So that's a good example. But another example I'd throw out is the Proliferation Security Initiative, where you had a number of countries, first small and then larger, who would get together and voluntarily decide, because they were so worried about the transfer of nuclear material that could be used to build bombs, et cetera, that they would take action and they would sanction nations who were acting outside of that. So you can see that maybe apply in this area as well. So you get these voluntary groups of countries coming together in larger groups and taking both actions themselves where they're forbearing from doing things, but also taking actions against those who violate that. So I think that's more in the long term, but I think there's a number of analogies here.
Sorin, I want all of you guys to comment on the Article 5 thing, because I'm going to push back a little bit on the notion that you just maybe exclusively, that cyber is a domain that goes with the other domains of warfare at this point, right? It's cross-cutting, it touches the other ones, but it is a domain unto itself as well. And so when you talked about the worst-case scenario of, for example, a major bank, whether it's or a Google or some other, mass data mover, the question becomes, if you can launch an attack that devastates that capability, and results in the devastation of a certain amount of physical infrastructure that goes with it, right? I mean, for the longest time, the biggest fear that folks had was, at what point do you damage hardware permanently and irrevocably? And the thing is, we've had that capability. We've chosen not to use it, but we're seeing that cat may be out of the bag and been used at other times. Does the alliance have to start thinking about what the implications of that are from an Article 5 context, not to sound like a salon intellectual on this issue, but at what point do you have to decide and discuss, hey, wait a minute, this happened, and oh, by the way, China did this to the United States, in which case NATO ends up getting pulled into something, just like NATO ended up getting pulled into Afghanistan, even though the attacks were against the United States. Right?
Well, the Article 5 link, it's indeed an interesting issue, especially since NATO in this new policy agreed to include cyber defense under collective defense. But I think we should remind us that Article 5 was by design something that should be invoked politically by nations in a specific context, on a case-by-case basis. There was never any automaticity or any threshold-determined link to Article 5. As a matter of fact, the only time it was invoked was after 9/11, which was a scenario that has never been contemplated by the founding fathers. So Article 5 was never designed to be triggered by a certain threshold, and it will not be triggered by thresholds from the cyber point of view as well. So there is a conscious decision by allies in this policy that there is benefit in keeping flexibility and ambiguity over in which context such Article 5 decision would apply. And it's also stated that this will be decided by the heads, by the allies, politically on a case-by-case basis. But I would also try to give you a kind of hint of how the link is made, and it's also reflected in the public Wales Summit declaration. Because before linking cyber defense to collective defense in Article 5, the declaration states that cyber attacks can reach a threshold that threatens national and Euro-Atlantic prosperity, security, and stability. Their impact could be as harmful to modern society as conventional attack. We affirm, therefore, that cyber defense is part of NATO's core task of collective defense. So it is a hint. It's when the impact is as harmful as any other attack. And this will be decided politically on a case-by-case basis.
So first, I would say that it's likely that you won't have just a cyber incident alone. That'd be part of a larger conflict, and that's what Jay said, and I think that's likely. But nevertheless, I think we have been worried for some time about the major cyber incident where it actually does affect infrastructure, where it takes it down. It has really large systemic effects that do mirror what you do in the kinetic space. And so it's not surprising that cyber should be under the same rubric of Article 5, that depending on the effect, you would look at what the effects are. And that's certainly a high standard. It's a consensus standard. It's a political standard. It's a case-by-case standard, as it should be, and as it is in the physical world. And you talk, the other part of this is when you talk nationally about international law and the right to self-defense, and when something rises to a certain level, that also is a very factual case-by-case standard, and that's been true in the physical world as well. So I think it's a good recognition that these are not separate domains, if you use that term. They're not so separate that they're not integrated together. That what you should be doing in the physical world should apply in the cyber world too. And as you said, it is meant to affirm that we can use this tool, but it will be a case-by-case basis. We'll have to look at the circumstances. We'll have to look at the impact. Just like you would in any other incident.
And I really like that, because when we did our history book last year looking at cyber conflict, remember, the more strategically significant the conflict, the more similar it is the conflict in the air, land, and sea. And so for most of the bad cyber conflicts, like Estonia 2007, there was clear warning. The Estonians knew the attack was coming 2 weeks beforehand. They could not just see the Russian language boards getting interesting, but they knew that they had a big neighbor getting angry with them, and they knew the kinds of things that could happen from that. So sometimes we say cyber, the warning is going to be difficult. Like, it's going to come out of the blue, it's going to be network speed. It's true at the tactical level, but it's not really true at the level of conflict. You're likely to have warning because you can see the geopolitical situation start to unravel. A single cyber attack, a single press of the enter key, has rarely, if ever, been particularly interesting or decisive. Cyber conflicts are like fighting in the air, land, and sea. You don't just have to hit once. you have to do battle damage assessment and continue to restrike the target as the people you're hitting come back up. So it's, again, it's unlikely that it's going to be just network speed. It's likely to unfold over time, which I think is very helpful for Article 5 deliberations, right? People think, oh, cyber, it's like this. How can you decide? No, you're likely to have, just like you did for Crimea, some unfolding over days, weeks, or even months. And because it's tied, cyber crises are tied to physical crises, like Chris just mentioned, I think Article 5 is likely to be easier than we think. Still difficult, because any Article 5 decision is going to be difficult. But I think we tend to fall to the mystique, to the mysticism of cyber, and we keep imagining, oh, but what if it's really spooky? And what if it comes from the blue? And what if it's made to look like it's coming from another country? Even though that rarely, if ever, has actually happened.
With that, let me open it to the floor. I think, Harlan, I saw your hand go up earlier.
Yeah, it's coming around.
I think you can yell, but we'll give you a microphone anyway.
Thank you. I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. I'd like to thank the panel for a very interesting and provocative presentation. I've got two questions. One is for Ambassador Ducaru, and the second question is for Jay and also for you, Vago, surprisingly. Sorin, I wonder, by way of background, if you might help us think through, what do you think is Vladimir Putin's strategy vis-a-vis Ukraine and Europe? Where do you think it's headed? What do you think? How do you see this ending if it does? And what should we be doing that we're not doing, and what are we doing that we should not be doing? And for Vago and Jay, Jay, first a critique. I would argue that war today, if you take a look at Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, is about the people. And if that's the case, then this ain't the same as air, sea, and land, because you have a situation in which armies are not fighting other armies. And if the Islamic State were to get a huge cyber capability, that would be quite interesting to ponder. My question is this, however, for both of you. Yesterday in the FT, the head of GCHQ had a rather remarkable piece in which he said the problem may be our own social media, Google, et cetera, et cetera. Jay alluded to this. How do you respond to that? And also, right now, as you know, Bold Alligator is a NATO amphibious operation taking place in Norfolk. One of the big problems we have there is interoperability. Now, NATO has been chasing interoperability since before many people in this room were born. But if we can't seem to get interoperability right, what does that suggest about cyber? Does that give cyber certain opportunities, or does it make possibly cyber even more difficult to institute among the alliance?
I'll
Like
answer.
Sorin about Russia.
Right.
Well, this is not a. It was. I suppose it wasn't a question that was necessarily linked to any cyber strategy, but on a broader strategy. It's hard to say, and I don't know what President Putin's strategy is. I probably would be an oracle, but I can say what we see in Ukraine and analyze on basis on what we see. And what we see is that after the illegal annexation of Crimea, the focus was on separating this southern eastern part of Ukraine from Ukraine proper, and we see a new kind of a frozen conflict area. And I think it's not necessarily a new pattern. I took part just a week ago at a book launching in Brussels about a book about war in Transnistria. It was a book called Chronicle of an Undeclared War, and written by that time Defense Minister of Republic of Moldova. And many of the patterns that we see in Ukraine were there. It was, and then I also saw an analysis by somebody that knows the regions very well, Vlad Sokor from Jamestown Foundation, who actually describes the steps of this pattern. So if you follow the pattern, it's not even surprising that you could see like escalation of a warm conflict up to a point when let's say in case of Ukraine it reached a point where it could be only de-escalation, but with what price? With a price of having or losing de facto control over a region. And then the next step was just quote unquote, not logical, but to be expected, was these so-called elections that no one, that were separate from the one in Ukraine, that were not recognized neither by the Ukrainian government, not by international community. So this is what's happening. It's a bigger scale. It's a bigger, let's say, territory. But it's a pattern that it's easy to follow. So one should draw the conclusions for following these patterns.
Jay?
Yeah. On the GCHQ, this has been. It reminds me of the crypto wars from 15 or 20 years ago. In the 90s, the government was saying, we had cryptography we don't want to be widespread, or if it's going to be widespread, we want to make sure the U.S. government has a backdoor. Because if we don't control this technology, like ammunition, then everybody's going to be able to encrypt. And if everybody's able to encrypt, it means the people that we have a right to listen, or we need to listen to, like criminals or terrorists, we're not going to have access to their communications. And so this is an echo of those times of governments. It started with Director Comey saying that Apple and the other companies that are going to encrypt things so that they can't even get it back are, they didn't quite say operating in an unpatriotic manner, but I think that was part of the underlying. Came up yesterday with GCHQ saying that Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp are the command and control networks
Of choice.
of terrorists, and these companies have to get used to, they've got to come to terms with the dark uses of the technology. And of course, I completely get the argument that they're trying to make. Although after I left being a government signals intelligence guy, I went to the private sector. I went to Goldman Sachs, working not too far from Randy Ford. And in the finance sector, risk isn't a bad thing. You have both upside risk and downside risk. And you have to take risks so that you can get benefits. Right? If you're not taking risks, you're not going to make any money, and things will never move forward. And whenever I hear the GCHQs, the NSAs of the world, we're largely talking about the downside risks, the bad things that are going to happen if we're not doing this right. We rarely hear from governments talking about the upside risk. And it's very curious to see the words that we talk about. If we say cyber, we're generally talking about the downside risks. Right? If we say, oh, well, we want to talk cyber, then you're talking about cyber crime, cyber warfare, cyber espionage. You're thinking of all the terrible things that can happen to us. If we talk about internet, then we're talking about innovation. We're talking about internet freedom and freedom of speech and all of the good things that can accrue to us. And we tend not to be. This town right now, cyber and the downside, has more voice, more budget, easier interagency process, larger organizations and skills than the innovation, than the internet side. Right, what's America's cyber power? Well, it's Fort Meade, right? That's why they're going to get the 6,000 people. If you say, what's our internet power? Well, then you say, well, that's San Francisco. And so we're going to have to come to terms to this. And unfortunately, the U.S. government and the British government largely made this bed in what we've learned from Snowden and others. And they're having to lie in it right now. I mean, these companies have seen their technologies get weaponized, and they're upset about it. They're seeing slides that say top secret SI on the top of them that have their infrastructure, and they're U.S. companies that pay taxes to the U.S. government for the most part.
So just one comment on it. I disagree with Jay in the view that the weighting is all on the bad things that are happening on the security side. In fact, one of the reasons when we did the international strategy for cyberspace just a couple of years ago was specifically we talked about not just the bad things, we talked about the good things. Yep. And you have to keep in mind that security is not an end in itself, that in fact you're trying to enable the good things, the innovation, the growth, the societal growth, the economic growth. And when we do a lot of our diplomacy around the world, there are a lot of countries in the developing world who are on the fence. You have some of the more repressive regimes are saying we need to have sovereignty over the internet, we need to draw boundaries around our space. Arguably more difficult if you're violating physical sovereignty, but they've been making those arguments. Yeah. And then you have on the other side, the U.S. and many other countries saying no, you need this free and open internet, which has been a major part of our policy. And you have a lot of countries who are worried about stability, so they have some sympathy for the one argument, but they want to see economic growth. So a lot of our policy has been based on the economic growth, the innovation, the social growth you have, and you have to keep that in mind even when you're talking about security, even when you're talking about cyber conflict and cyber crime, and that strategy put all of those things together deliberately so it's a more cohesive policy. It's not emphasizing just the bad things, it's looking at the good things and the bad things together and how you can have them together. Because Jay is right that up to a few years ago, these communities never talked to each other. I remember, I tell the story, we had the Aspen Institute a couple of years ago, had a cyber security thing, and Joe Nye and others, and Brent Scowcroft in one room, and you had lots of luminaries and government officials there. In the other room, it was the future of the internet, where you had Craig from Craigslist and Craig Monday and a whole bunch of people there. They didn't even know each other were in the same building, Yeah. And so this was amazing, and Craig and I got together and we made sure that we all got together. Right. That, I think, is better now. It's not perfect. There are people, the human rights community, the economic community, and the security community are still pretty distinct communities. But one of the big efforts is to get them to talk together. And in government, the big change there is when we have these coordination meetings at the White House, when I have them at the State Department, we're doing all of government dialogues with other countries. They're not limited to security. We're talking about internet governance. We're talking about human rights online, internet freedom. We're forcing the other governments to bring all the different parts of their silos together to talk to us. And so that's been a change too. It's an evolving thing. But I think it's dangerous if you just look at any of those things in isolation and don't have that cross-pollination.
Yeah, and you're right. The international strategy does a great job of bringing this together. But if you read if you look in the international strategy or our other strategies, and you look for words like attack or espionage or offense or the rest, it's something that they do to us. It's something that other adversaries do. And the United States is on the receiving end of that. And so I love that strategy that it brought together both sides of this, both the economic.
And I disagree there too. Even in that strategy, it talks about deterrence. It talks about the United States would use all capabilities, diplomatic, economic, and even military as a last resort. So I would disagree with even that characterization, Jay. I'd say it really did try to deal with the whole suite of activities. And as the ambassador knows, when we do a lot of these public speakings, we do bring all these different issues together.
I do have a cyber attack question I'd like, but do you still want me to answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So I thought I could get away with not answering it actually. First, I think it's very, very easy to look at being critical is important because you're not improving unless you're being self-critical all the time, right? So all of us have to have kind of a Kaizen model of how do we get better at doing whatever it is that we're doing. But if I look at it from a NATO interoperability standpoint, Afghanistan made quantum leaps and bounds in our ability as an alliance to communicate with one another. Whether it was for air operations or for ground operations, I think the Balkan War was that was really the big sort of wake-up call where there were unsecure communications that were going on among allied nations that were, were problematic. And we there's still an enormous amount of work to do as an alliance, but I think that there's been tremendous progress made. Some of it is bilateral progress, some of it is trilateral progress, right? I mean, the U.S. Air Force, the RAF and the French Air Force got together to try to work as being like, hey, look, we're three air forces that find ourselves engaged in the same sorts of places. Let's figure out, ways and better understandings on how we operate. That paid dividends has paid dividends not only, I think, in Afghanistan, but as well as in Libya and as well as in Mali, where U.S. forces have been able to interact, and UK forces and other forces with French forces engaged there. About the IS thing, look, I mean, it's an eternal game of cat and mouse between, guys who are trying to keep secrets and guys who are trying to get secrets. And so ultimately, it's not the first time that public means or hiding in plain sight has been used as an espionage tool. There are things that were published in classified pages in newspapers. There are radio signals, radio messages, and commercials that were totally fake, that were designed to be means of clandestine communication. And so I think that the big issue here is, and going and hearkening back to something that Jay earlier said, which is, you're not going to get the freebie door. You're going to have to negotiate the door to get it, because anything that's encrypted has a key to it, and as long as you have the key, that's the key. Not to sound funny about it, but so I think that this is one of those sort of cyclical things. There is opportunity and there's risk to it. I mean, one of the things which I find most interesting is the whole global defense organism is changing with staggering speed in terms of the power of the communications tools and everything else, and that can be used both as powers of economic gain and good, or dangerous tools that should be feared. It's a double-edged sword. You just have to figure out how to end up cutting with it. And this notion of us being sort of this wayfish, we're being assaulted. We're pretty good at stealing crap from other people, whether it's ended up at the bottom of the ocean or whether it's buried in somebody's server bank somewhere, where people like Jay actively work to help us with that. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what you did. You'll have to kill me now. But there was another question right there.
Thank you. I'm Randy Fort with Raytheon. Jay, you made a point in your initial comments about how this internet and this infrastructure is significantly the creation of the private sector, not the government. And the estimates vary, 80, 85, 90% of all internet cyber infrastructure is private sector owned. The first two speakers, Ambassador Ducaru and Chris, in all of your conversation, you made no reference whatsoever to the private sector and all of these policy issues that you're going on and all these norms and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of sensing you've talked about this a little bit since, but as you go forward on the policy side to think about these norms, when are you going to get outside of the strictly NATO government-to-government context and start bringing in these private sector significant interest groups, be they individual companies or coalitions, who do own the infrastructure, who are the creative engine, who are building the innovations and coming up with the apps and all the new devices and so forth that are driving all of this? When do they get a say in terms of what these norms and policies and so forth should be?
So maybe you want to start? Go ahead.
Yes, I thought I mentioned the launch of the NATO cyber industry partnership as one of the big deliverables of this policy. But maybe I did not articulate it enough, also because of I wanted to stick into kind of concise time frame. And even, and I will come in being a bit more granular on this, but even before this policy, NATO as an institution has been engaged with industry in a number of ways. And let me give you some examples. We have already for a number of years NATO Information Assurance Seminar or Forum, which this year in, I think, mid-September, got together close to 1,000 representatives of industry. I think it was the 8th or 10th edition and so on. So it's a tradition in this sense. NATO has the so-called NATO Industry Advisory Group since the 60s. Now this NIAG, as we call it, has developed a distinct cyber dimension and has developed 3 studies on cyber. One of the last study was also one of the basis of elaborating the elements of the NCIP, NATO Industry Cyber Partnership. Atlantic Command Transformation, ACT, has industry engagement on a number of levels.
And has a
NCIRC,
forum on the 13th in Split,
exactly.
Croatia.
NCIRC, the NATO Computer Incident Response Center, has a secure portal where that allows information exchange in a kind of trusted environment with industry. My own division, Emerging Security Challenges, is organizing every year a so-called cyber workshop, cyber defense workshop, which includes representatives of governments and industry discussing together concrete, mainly technical and aspect with some political links. This is usually a smaller circle event where industry participated if it has something to share. And they discuss like campaigns or specific malware with people from intelligence, from governments, and so on. So this is happening as we speak. This year, so in 2 weeks from now, we will have the Cyber Coalition 2014 exercise, and for the first time, industry is participating as an observer to the exercise, but the trend is actually to have industry participating as such. Last year, industry participation was emulated by some government representatives. So just to give you the trend, I mean, so it was against this background that the NATO industry cyber partnership was launched, and I will give you a sense of what it is, because you asked me when. First, my question to this is, actually it's happening, and then we are at the stage where there has been a kind of change of mindset in NATO, in opening to industry, by recognizing that the industry owns 80% plus of networks and so on, which is it's also recognized in the summit declaration, communique, industry is the lead in technological development. So again, maybe I cut it too short in my introduction, but it's actually one of the high points the enhanced policy. Just to give you a sense of what the objectives of the partnership with industry is, the aim is to facilitate a voluntary engagement between NATO and industry. The objectives are from improving cyber defense in, for example, supply chain, facilitate participation of industry in relevant multinational smart defense projects, contributing to alliance efforts in defense education training, cyber defense education training and exercises, building on existing initiatives on NATO industry engagement, sharing of best practices, expertise, exchange of information, of course, raise awareness, get efficient and adequate support in case of cyber incidents. So, well, the list is longer, but I will stop here.
So let me say that for us, really dealing with industry, the private sector, and other stakeholders too, is core to the way we go forward in a lot of these issues. And I can start with that even in the development of a number of the White House documents. When we did the cyberspace policy review when President Obama first came into office, we talked extensively to industry groups, both trade associations and other groupings of industry, to get input for that. The lawyers are always uncomfortable when you're doing a presidential document when you're talking outside the White House, but we were doing quite a bit of that. We were consulting on that. And then when we did the international strategy, I went and I briefed and talked to and got input from a number of industry groups to make sure that we were pulling in the right direction, because even though that was a U.S. government document, it was a document which necessarily needed, I think, to have both the buy-in and participation of industry. And then I should say also applaud all of the things that we fully endorse, all the activities that NATO is doing with industry. We think that is an important partnership. We've endorsed this in the EU and other forums that we've worked in. It's no accident that the international strategy starts off with the economic issues and ends with the human rights issues and has the kind of crispy bits in between, as Jay says, the security and other issues. I mean, that was really important to us. I regularly have consultations with industry groups before just regularly anyway, because I understand that surprisingly the government doesn't have all the answers to these things, and they can identify for us both risks that are out there, but also opportunities for us to engage. When we do capacity building, we've done a lot of capacity building in Africa. We've done regional ones in East Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa. We actually have the private sector as part of that because we want to model to other countries this idea of a public-private partnership and even a multi-stakeholder approach to these issues, and make it, walk the walk and not just talk the talk, and do that. And so that's been important. And then even in the area of when we're talking about these norms of development, I mentioned some of these peacetime norms. A lot of those, I think, are both very popular with the private sector because we talk about attacks on infrastructures, but they're ones we've had discussions with the private sector about, both structured discussions and discussions in the context of a number of different meetings around the world, including the London process that began in London, and then we had one in Budapest, and we had one in Korea last year, and the next one will be in The Hague in April, where we've had both industry and government people talking precisely about these issues and going forward. And as Jay mentioned, even in conference building measures, there's some role for industry. So this is such a core way of us dealing with issues that if I didn't emphasize it, I should have. This is certainly something we care deeply about. I will say sometimes it's messy. When we did one of the 11, we had 11 recommendations from the cyberspace policy review too. I don't know why. But one of them was to build an incident response plan, which DHS had the lead on. And we built that from the ground up, not just with the government, but we had industry there, we had other folks there. It was a very messy process, but it ended up with a document which had much more buy-in from those folks who, as you say, own and operate a lot of the infrastructure. So I do think that's a critically important role, and I didn't mean to underestimate that at all. And I think that we need to hear those voices, and not just the private sector voices, but also other voices. And a lot of the things, like when the two of us were just in Bonn, we were speaking at the Munich Security Conference, not in Munich, but in Bonn, on cybersecurity, and there were lots of private sector people in the room there too, and the whole point of that, mainly private sector.
Sydney, let me take your question, and then this gentleman over here. Then you, and then you.
Hi, gentlemen. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. To look at threats and scary bad things again, apologies to Dr. Healey. Let me ask, we're seeing sort of different models of threats. The Estonia case has not been replicated. As people said, in Georgia and I guess to a degree in Ukraine, cyber was integrated with, proxy troops on the ground and irregular forces and a whole host of other measures. But conversely, you also see China, which seems to be doing cyber, at least against the U.S. industry, kind of in isolation as its own thing. So, and then there's a question of how the U.S. and NATO themselves integrate cyber into electronic warfare, both to protect and attack networks. If cyber is not this sort of thing by itself off in space, but one part of this domain of this world of conflict that we have precedent and law and policy that, from history that applies, how do we weave it into both our arsenal, but also how do we deal with adversaries like Russia, which are sort of organized crime / governments, weaving it into their whole array of different means, instruments of national power in a very different sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll jump on this. I think there were a couple of points that you made. One was about the diversity of models, and Estonia was one model. I think probably in the case of Georgia and Ukraine, because it could be blended into a kind of more classical military operation. It felt like more straightforward of doing it this way, which in the case of a NATO country like Estonia was not the case. That was a typical cyber DDoS, high level and then high intensity DDoS attack. The other point was about blending it into the cyber dimension into operations. Here I need to make a comment. NATO's mandate in cyber is about cyber defense, is not about cyber security at large, so it doesn't deal with cyber crime issues and so on. From this point of view, it's narrower than the EU's mandate or so on. And it's not about cyber warfare or cyber attack or cyber offensive weapons. So the mandate is to assure the resilience, assure prevention, protection, resilience, and also detect and defend and recover, but using the spectrum of defensive cyber means. Now, at the national level, nations have their own strategies, and that strategies are less narrow than NATO's mandate. Let me put it this way. So I want to also make a point that the only capabilities that NATO develops are on the cyber defense side. It is this NATO Computer Incidents Response Center, the centralized protection over 50+ sites, rapid reaction teams. But frankly, NATO as an organization doesn't own many capabilities of its own in the conventional sector as well. What NATO, it has a command structure, and it has, it is a platform of political dialogue, coordination, and decision. But again, the capabilities, the NATO capabilities, are on the cyber defense side. The point of looking into what several adversaries are doing and how to respond to this. This is very much, for example, linked to NATO's discussion and analysis on the hybrid warfare concept. And the fact that the cyber dimension fits very well into this concept that brings together the conventional with the non-conventional, the low and high-tech elements, the regular and the irregular. It brings also this element of deniability of responsibility. So this is one of the most, I would say, relevant and interesting analysis and discussion within NATO. We actually have a tasker to come with the results of the study of vis-a-vis how this hybrid warfare has developed and is employed worldwide, and especially in the Ukraine context by Russia. And the next phase actually will be even the more relevant, getting the right responses from NATO to cope with such a threat.
Let me just ask an offensive cyber question. I mean, there increasingly has been debate that for the purposes of defense, you need to have much more powerful offensive capabilities that you use, right? So defense has to be much more active. You have to be able to do pursuit, at least so the argument goes. And even Admiral Rogers recently has added his voice to, the role of offensive in defensive operations, right? And you could always argue that from a deterrent standpoint, it's the ability that you're going to get hit in the head in return is what really drives you, right? You're not just going to stop him at the border, but he may actually get kinetic on you in a far different manner. How do we need to be thinking about offensive cyber operations? You said obviously that the posture of the alliance is a defensive one, but ultimately, and I don't know, maybe I should start with you, Jay. Because you pride yourself on sticking pins into some of these notions, but what's the way to think about it, and what's the role of offensive capabilities in what would be ordinarily construed as a defensive?
The attacker has always had the advantage in the internet. Maybe not since day one, but since day two. I mean, when we were doing the book, we found quotes back to 1979 saying the attacker always gets through. So for over 35 years. So it's natural, especially if you're in the United States, We can't do defense very well. We kind of suck at it. But we're very proud of our offensive capability.
We're the Chicago Cubs of defense.
Right. Yeah, so I say we're the, anytime you talk to a cyber expert, remember, we're the losing team. We've lost pretty much every year since 1979. We're at best playing 500 ball. Be very cautious when you get advice from us because we're the losing team, the Chicago Cubs of the internet, right? So, so we know we suck at defense. We know we're great at offense. Most of us, many of us came from the military where we have terms of defense and why should we take punches? We should punch back. So it's very tempting for us military. Companies want to do it. When we say companies want to do it, we tend to back off from that. If you think companies should attack back, you're largely going down an armed society is a polite society, right? I mean, it's better if more people have the capability to attack is going to make everything a little bit better. When you hear the government want to do it, remember that most of the attacks are successful. Most attacks are successful because defense hasn't patched their systems. That the United States routinely shows up in the top 1, 2, 3 dirtiest internets in the world. That, yes, we have our things that tick us off about what other countries are doing, but other countries have a list of things that they don't like that we're doing, particularly those that Snowden has revealed, that they may feel entitled to take their own steps to stop us from doing those things. So I am very cautious about that. I think I would feel much better about DoD wanting to step up the offense if DoD were better at having a cleaner house to begin with.
Comments?
So a couple things I'd say. One is, and this goes to your prior question too, I think in 20 years or 25 years, we're not going to be talking about cyber as a separate thing. I mean, it's going to be integrated, and it should be integrated. I mean, one of the big pushes that we've been leading at the State Department is to integrate this as a normal foreign policy issue and not some odd duck over there, which people don't understand. So we talk about cyber a lot now. We probably will for the next 5 or 10 years. Eventually, this is going to get integrated both in terms of all of our defensive capabilities and all of our capabilities. And indeed, if we think about some of these issues, and I think Jay pointed this out when he was looking at the NATO background, a lot of the deterrence aspect is deterrence by denial. What we can do better to defend our networks and have resilience for those networks under the understanding that you're not going to always be able to defend them. And so I think that's an important part of it. The other thing I'd say is that, I certainly agree if companies are doing these activities, there's lots of dangers involved, including, you might be hitting an innocent proxy, you could be causing all kinds of issues there. For governments, I think largely this is being integrated with all their other capabilities, but it's important to be using any capability like this with lots of caution because there are a lot of issues, there are chances of escalation, there are other issues that are out there, and you need to make sure how you're using it when. And for the U.S., I think we've been clear that we always will exhaust law enforcement, network defense, and other possibilities before we even consider this. So I think this is being integrated around the world. Some of the norms work we've been doing and work with respect to the applicability of international law in this space, I think is important over time. But I think we just need to, not always be talking about cyber war, but think about how we can better defend networks.
I would first echo what Jay said. I think in NATO there's a conscience that there's so much to be still done to achieve strong resilience and protection of networks, that this is the main focus, and this is also one of the great elements of deterrence because you're equipped, you're resilient enough to not to let's say be not to have a real effects, significant effects after significant cyber attacks. Now, this being said, and by the way, it's in tune with the cyber defense mandate. The fact that we see this kind of higher end threats is, I think, generating more openness for a larger debate. We don't use in any of NATO documents, you won't see anything of cyber offense, offensive weapons, not even the high-end threat concept. They are not defined, at least in our taxonomy. That's why there's no reference. The only reference that we have now in official and public documents is that these threats could be reaching or could be as harmful as conventional ones.
Don't we need to do that?
But the truth is that in let's say, informal debates, there is discussion without even having a clear definition, because the discussion is triggered what happens in the real world.
Right. Okay. There are a few hands that are still up there. We're going to go through a lightning round, so I will ask forbearance of the panelists. Yes, you, sir?
I think it's David Sanger is in the back also.
Oh, he is.
Hi, Sean Lingus with Federal Computer Week.
Okay.
This is a question for Ambassador Painter. Just a very straightforward question about the aid advice that the U.S. gives NATO in terms of cyber, the resources coming from the U.S. government to NATO. Does that include everything from lessons from the NIST framework and Cyber Command, U.S. Cyber Command, to DHS, to what state's doing on it? Are you lending expertise in the form of personnel, technology? Just a straightforward one on that. Thanks.
Do you want to take a bunch of questions and have us answer? Or
No,
is that-
let's give
okay.
brief
Okay,
answer to that
so
question, then I'll take her.
Brief answer quite
David.
a bit, and obviously our Department of Defense does a lot of work with NATO. Our Department of Homeland Security and the NIST framework is a good example on dealing with the private sector. Again, I should say one of my folks, Len House, who's in the audience, is now just been approved as a senior civilian advisor to NATO. So there's been a lot of, and Len has a long background in the communications industry, worked for Motorola back in the day, and so there's been a lot of work on that, and it's important to support these efforts. And of course, we talk often too.
Absolutely, and just to mention, Michael Daniel has briefed the Cyber Committee in June, and looking forward to have you, Chris, later this year. So this is part of the ongoing interaction.
Right here, please.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Nakashima with the Washington Post, and since I'm a reporter, I love hypotheticals that I know sometimes you all don't like, but I find them very instructive, actually, in trying to think through possible responses and policy choices, and I know it's what you all work through with tabletops. So while I largely agree that any real disruptive or destructive cyber attack will take place in conjunction with a more traditional military operation, what we have seen happen in real life, so this is not a hypothetical, is attacks attributed to Iran on Saudi Aramco. I think, Ambassador, you referred to them earlier, as well as to Rosgas in Qatar. Although I guess Secretary Panetta referred to them in his first major cyber speech a year and a half ago or so, it really didn't provoke that large, I think, sort of international or national debate. But what if the same sort of attack had happened, and just remember, this attack wiped out the data on, was it 30,000 computers on Saudi Aramco, leading the oil company to have to replace all of those. What if the same sort of attack had happened to ExxonMobil or a U.S. Oil or gas company, and at the same time to BP or a British oil and gas company, wiping out, destroying the hard drives of tens of thousands of computers? Is that the sort of attack that would give rise to a, say, an Article 5 type of response, and be in any sort of governmental response? And if so, what, practically speaking, could any government do in response, apart from the mitigation, the rushing in to remediate, which I know you all would do in a heartbeat? Would you try to retaliate under, self-defense? Would you try to take out, say, the computers of the offending nation state, which let's say would be in the Middle East and is not a member of the UNGGE or something like that?
Gentlemen?
A quick response is, I don't know, it depends.
Well, how would you think about it? How would you think about it?
It depends on the context. If it links with something else, like
and it's not in conjunction with a military attack, let's say, or military operation.
again, it depends about impact. It depends about, does it involve human lives? Does it?
Right.
It depends on the clarity of attribution. So again, the answer is, frankly, no one would know, and it will be the result of a political decision in that specific context.
Granted. And this is why this is interesting is that, let's say there was no loss of life. So Chris, does this fall into one of your sort of, is it high threshold, sub-high threshold? Does it reach arms?
So
how would you think about it?
Again, the reporters like hypotheticals, and I don't actually respond to hypotheticals very much, but what I'd say is this, that I would say that the Saudi Aramco attack, I think, was a wake-up call in terms of people understanding, and certainly when we talk internationally, I see a lot more awareness raised because of this. In any particular incident, as the ambassador said, you'd have to look at the impact, you'd have to look at the effects, you'd have to look at what kind of response that would trigger in that incident, and I'm not going to guess because, hypotheticals are hypotheticals.
I dare say, though, with tens of thousands of computers destroyed
Even there, I would push back really hard on that, because so the computers got destroyed. So what? That was a failed attack, right? Assuming that the Iranians were doing that to disrupt oil, they failed to disrupt oil. So, and I get very frustrated when I get this from Cyber Command, and I've gotten this from the highest levels there of like, woo, 30,000 computers. It's a failed attack. If they were trying to disrupt, even if they disrupted oil, to put it in the phrase of your question, if they disrupted oil for a day, we're not going to get there. If they disrupted oil for 4 weeks, then to me we really start getting into that place. And to get to something that the ambassador mentioned earlier, right? This is a political decision.
Exactly.
So you're going to have to hit that place where, to me, most of the world is looking, like when we declared Article 5, it was after 9/11, right? It didn't fit any of the law theories that were going at the time that we could attack Afghanistan because of a non-state.
But if you started to disrupt worldwide oil...
Right, but afterwards the world said, you're right, you got attacked, Afghans not doing anything about it, go get them, right? It changed because the world said. If we just said, 30,000 computers, I don't think to a significant degree most of the world, or even in the United States, we would just say, you should have protected them better. If it's a month, if it's a couple weeks, if it's really affecting the world economy.
Well, you're basically saying $300,000 is not enough for it to trigger anything.
Right.
No, and I want to round this up, because when I said I don't know when it depends, it frankly depends on the political wisdom of political leaders in that specific context, and frankly there's no predetermined threshold that could be applied, to be very honest. But all these things are playing with scenarios.
It's impact, it's effect, it's attributions, all those things, right?
David, let me take you, and then we'll have one more over there, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead.
All the way in the back.
All the way in the back, yeah.
Thanks very much, David Sanger from the New York Times. I wanted to take you back to your deterrence discussion before, because this differs in many ways from every other kind of attack and weapon system that NATO can call upon, because in NATO's cases, as Sorin pointed out, you have access to other countries' weaponry if they decide to go do this. But in the case of cyber, none of the major NATO members, including the United States, has talked publicly about their offensive capability, except in the broadest of terms. And as a result, you don't have the kind of level of deterrence that you have in nuclear, conventional, drones, any of that. So is it your view that because the world knows that the US and Britain and others have this capability, that's enough to create a deterrent out there? Or do we need to be in a position where the President, the Prime Minister, and others begin to describe not only the doctrine, but the capability?
It was to me, it was certainly the General Cartwright's point, right? We need people to be scared of us. Now, I think it's pretty well established at this point, the capability that the United States has. Like, I don't think that has to get done. But my main point on deterrence is that, to me, deterrence is obviously working. Obviously. But only above a certain threshold. If I came to you as a journalist and I said, we're going to have a major attack, a digital Pearl Harbor, and you say, oh, that's good, and it makes the paper, and we talk 5 years afterwards and it hasn't happened yet, would you call me out on it and think I was a fraud? What if it was 10 years or 20 years? We started talking about digital Pearl Harbor in 1991. So we're 23 years on from when we first started saying this massive attack is coming. So to me, we've got to explain that. If we've been warning about this massive attack for 23 years, it hasn't happened yet, we have to explain why. And we said digital Pearl Harbor because assumedly we feel our throats are bared to the capabilities of other countries. And assumedly they feel like their throats are bared to our capabilities. And so if we haven't been doing it, from what I can find, no one's died from a cyber attack yet. So if these nations haven't been doing this to each other above that major level to really do these kinds of attacks that Ellen has talked about or that have hit in Article 5, to me, nations are showing restraint. And if we're talking about any other kind of military capability, we'd call that restraint deterrence. Now, just like nuclear weapons, right? At a time in the 40s or 50s, we might have thought that nuclear weapons made all warfare unthinkable. But it didn't. You could still do Korea, you could still have proxy wars, you could still have Nicaragua, Angola, and the rest. It just meant there was an upper threshold. I think cyber deterrence is operating the same way. It's not deterring crime, it's not deterring espionage, theirs or ours. It's not deterring Estonia's or Saudi RAS gases, but nations seem to be resistant to go and really disrupt each other's economies or militaries using cyber, just like they are unwilling to use military or other capabilities to do that. And that's getting exactly to these points that I think Chris and the ambassador are making, is that in a lot of ways this isn't that different.
So the one just a glean on that too is that even the precept of your question is that you respond to something, some cyber incident with cyber alone, and we've been clear in saying that that's not true. You could be, if you have a cyber incident that is significant enough, you use all tools of national power, which include diplomatic, include trade, include military, not necessarily even necessarily confined to cyber. But I think another part of this is when I talk about these below the very high threshold of norms, when I'm talking about some of those issues like refraining from attacking infrastructures. I mean, that's another way where you build deterrence by getting the collection of countries who agree with that and enforce that. And I think that's a longer term game, but that's part of deterrence too.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Well, I think it's fair to say that NATO does not have any explicit deterrence policy. This reflects not a policy document or a doctrine or declaratory dimension or so on, but it has at least two very, very strong elements that actually have deterrence value. One is the strong focus on resilience, strong defenses, and this was mentioned before. And the other one is the link between cyber defense and collective defense and Article 5, with all the other, the things that have been left to political decision in a specific context. So these two elements have an effect, while I think the consensus by allies at this point have not led to anything less explicit or more elaborated in the sense the way David was hinting. So this is the level that we addressed it at this point.
I also, as a Dr. Strangelove fan, love the New York Times asking a deterrence question. There's one question over there, and I have one quick follow-up for Sorin, and I know we got to wrap this up. So yes, sir, thanks for your patience.
Hey, Joe Marks from Politico. One of the confidence building measures in Jay's report is the idea of an international, correct me if I read too fast, is an international body that would look at cyber attribution and try to have be seen as a confident arbiter of cyber attribution that would be comprised of the best cyber forensic nations, including the US, Russia, China, England. I'm wondering if the other panelists can talk about, first, the value of such an organization, and second, the prospects for it.
Well, I'd say that that just seems very premature and really not feasible at this point. I would say that the idea behind confidence building measures are real concrete measures that we can implement now that will build better confidence. I think this is better focused on more realistic and plausible ones that we can do now that are the transparency and cooperative measures that would, I think, promote a better understandings and avoid miscommunication between states. The other thing I worry about is when you create these there's a lot of people come up with this idea of like creating some new one ring that will rule them all kind of organization that's created somewhere that will, creating a new bureaucracy will do this and somehow have an effect. I worry more that when you create an organization like that, given some actors intense in this area, it then leads to issues, and this goes to the other issues in cyberspace, of more regulation of cyberspace, of trying to curtail content because some countries talk about information security, not cybersecurity. So, though an interesting idea, I think we should really focus on some of the practical stuff we can do right now.
And if you notice, in the report, we both have a weak version and a strong version. And the weak version says, when we have a big attack, let's do an ad hoc group that gets together that looks at this, and that's the one that I mentioned earlier. So it's not necessarily binding. It's not a new standing organization. Although, you say, all right, this happened. Let's get some smart people together to look at this. The one that you quoted was really the strong version of saying we could make it that it's got its own powers, that it's really binding, and someone very wise at Brussels once told me that you've got ideas and the answer might not be no, it's not yet. And we know that some of the ideas in the CBM documents, that some of them might fit into the not yet category.
And I also say there's some of the things proposed in that paper that are very much in line with what we're already doing. Like when I talked about the measures of self-restraint that I think are talked about in your report, these are exactly the kind of things I'm talking about in these peacetime norms.
Let me just ask before we break, because I know that we're already 7 minutes behind schedule, so I'll be adequately punished for that. So let me ask you a quick question about manpower. One of the challenges at NATO has been personnel cuts. Each one of the countries is struggling with budget cuts on their own and their own capabilities. But tell us a little bit about the impact of some of those personnel reductions and your ability and the alliance's ability to do some of the things that it's being asked to do.
Well, let me address this from the following angle. First, one should know that NATO is quite I would say, at least from the standards of international organization, quite neat, flexible, small and agile. I'll put it this way. If you would take the international civilian staff altogether, is a bit more than 1,200 with whole administration, and when you take on the political side, probably half of it. The command structure, as you know, has been strongly restructured to make it more flexible. Agencies have been reformed. We had 14 agencies, and now we have 2, NATO Communication Information Agency, NCIA, and then NATO Support Agency. So all this was part of, I would say, needed and welcome reform process that was asked and mandated by nations. I think I would emphasize the quality of people. Also the fact that we are trying to adapt to the evolving trends. To be honest, for example, the cyber team, small as it is, has been significantly growing in the last years, both at the political level and also at the agency level, at the technical level. I would not dwell into more details, but I think I would echo the point that was made at the Wales Summit and the commitment by leaders to invest more in security and defense, given the context that we're living in. And this is a commitment, a political commitment that was taken at the highest level. And I think this has to be and probably will be reflected also in terms of the investment in the organization itself. So it's not going to be only commitment and investment in each country's defenses, but also in the organization on which allies have also relying it in coordinating their defenses and actually guaranteeing their security and defense.
Gentlemen, thanks very, very much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much to the audience and your patience for us having gone. Thank you.